The heat of a Texas afternoon hung thick over the old Dry Creek auction barn. Dust floated lazily through the air as worn boots scraped across the wooden floorboards. The smell of hay, sweat, and something older, like time itself, clung to everything. The regulars had already taken their places in the bleachers, cowboy hats tilted low, eyes sharp, waiting for the next lot to walk through the pen. But today, something different was in the air. Whispers broke out near the back of the crowd. Heads turned slowly, some out of curiosity, others out of disbelief. There he was, Henry Malloy, the old horseman of Ash Hollow. At 74, Henry had lost his eyesight but not his pride. Wearing a weathered brown jacket and dark sunglasses, he tapped his cane steadily against the ground, led by a quiet auction assistant who guided him toward the front row. Henry's presence at the auction was unexpected. He hadn't been seen at one in years. To those who remembered, Henry had once bred some of the finest quarter horses in the county. But diabetes had taken his sight, and with it, most believed, his purpose. Some whispered that he had returned for one last companion, one last animal to bring a spark back to Malloy Ranch. But others weren't so kind. One man muttered under his breath, he wouldn't know a mule from a Mustang now. The joke spread quickly in low snickers, just loud enough for Henry to notice. That's when the next horse was brought out, or so they said. It wasn't a horse. It was a scruffy, undersized donkey with patches of missing fur and ears almost too big for its head. A few folks looked at each other, stifling laughter. The donkey let out a lazy bray, as if mocking the situation. The auctioneer, Vernon Pike, cleared his throat with exaggerated pride and raised his voice. Lot 94. Strong frame, steady gait, perfect for a man of taste and tradition. Henry stepped forward slowly, extending a hand. His fingers brushed the donkey's muzzle. He paused. The animal stood still, almost respectfully. "There's a calm in this one," Henry said, his voice soft, nearly reverent. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Nobody quite expected that. Then he raised his hand. "I'll take him," Henry said. The gavel slammed. The room murmured. A blind man had just bought a donkey, thinking it was a horse. Or had he? What no one could predict was how much that little donkey, Hank, was about to change everything. The ride back to Malloy Ranch was quiet. Henry sat in the passenger seat of the old pickup truck while the donkey, Hank, stood quietly in the trailer behind them. The road stretched long and empty, cutting through golden fields and abandoned barns. The truck rattled over a pothole, but Henry didn't flinch. He kept one hand resting on his cane, the other occasionally tapping the dashboard, lost in thought. He knew people were laughing. He could hear it in the silence that followed his bid, in the way no one tried to stop him, not even Vernon Pike. But Henry didn't care. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Somewhere deep down, the sting of humiliation was still there. Not because of the donkey, but because he had let his guard down. He'd trusted his instincts, and those instincts had led him to a creature that, by all outward appearances, was nothing but a joke. When they got back to the ranch, Henry stepped down from the truck slowly. He walked toward the trailer and stood still. Hank made a soft, low sound, more breath than bray, and Henry opened the latch. The donkey stepped out carefully, not panicked, not stubborn. Just calm. Henry let out a long breath and nodded, though no one was there to see it. Later that evening, Henry sat on the porch with a glass of water and Hank resting just a few feet away. The air had cooled, the cicadas sang in the trees, and the sky turned soft with the color of dusk. He leaned forward in his rocking chair and muttered, "You've got no idea what they're saying about us, do you, boy?" Hank's ears twitched. He didn't answer, but somehow that silence felt less empty than usual. That's when the gravel crunched. A car pulled into the driveway, and Henry tensed. He knew the sound of that engine. It was his granddaughter, Maggie. She hadn't visited in months, not since their argument about selling the ranch. The screen door creaked as she stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. "You bought a donkey?" she said, flat and direct. Henry didn't respond right away. He took another sip from his glass, then nodded. "I did," he said. "His name's Hank." Maggie blinked, caught off guard. "Are you serious?" Henry gave a half-smile. "As a heart attack." The silence between them stretched, filled with old wounds, unspoken regrets, and something else neither was ready to name. But something had changed. And neither of them, not even Maggie, could explain why Hank hadn't run, or why he kept staring at Henry like he understood everything. The next morning came early. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when Henry, cane in hand, made his way to the barn. He followed the now familiar sound of soft hoofbeats. Hank was already awake, quietly pacing inside the small enclosure Henry had set up the night before. "Mornin', boy," Henry said softly, reaching out. The donkey stepped forward without hesitation, nuzzling the old man's hand like an old friend. There was something oddly reassuring in the creature's stillness. Back at the house, Maggie watched from the kitchen window, arms folded. She had stayed the night, mostly out of guilt, partially out of concern. Something about seeing her grandfather walk beside that ragged little donkey had unsettled her. It wasn't just strange, it was off. Henry had never shown affection toward any animal since the accident that cost him his sight. That accident, and everything that followed, had pushed Maggie away for years. She stepped outside with a cup of coffee and walked toward the barn, boots crunching against gravel. "You really think this is going to fix anything?" she asked, her voice a mix of frustration and sadness. Henry didn't turn. "Nope," he said plainly. "But I think he might help me remember why I cared in the first place." Maggie stood in silence, her jaw tight. "You never cared when Mom died," she said quietly. "You locked yourself in that house and let the rest of us rot." Henry flinched. The words hit him like a slap. "I cared," he muttered, almost to himself. "I just didn't know how to show it." The barn fell quiet again. Hank let out a single low bray, like he was tired of the tension too. Maggie looked at the donkey and frowned. "Why him, Grandpa? Of all animals, why that one?" Henry leaned on the fence post, facing the direction of her voice. "Because he didn't run from me. Because when I touched him, I didn't feel shame or pity or judgment. I just felt peace." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment he seemed smaller, more fragile. Maggie opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. The man she remembered was proud, stubborn, unreachable. This version, quiet, broken, trying, was unfamiliar. Later that afternoon, a truck pulled up to the ranch. It was Vernon Pike. He stepped out with a grin too wide to be sincere. "Heard the news spread fast," he said smugly. "Thought I'd come see the famous blind man's mule up close." Henry stood by the porch, unmoved. But Maggie stepped in front of him, her eyes sharp. "He's not a mule," she said. "And he's not a joke." Vernon Pike let out a low whistle as he walked toward the porch, his boots kicking up dust with each heavy step. "Didn't mean to offend," he said, smirking. "Just didn't expect you to put your money down on a barnyard comedian, Malloy." Maggie stood firm between Vernon and her grandfather, her arms crossed and eyes cold. "You can turn around and go home, Mr. Pike," she snapped. "You already got what you wanted." Henry remained seated in his rocking chair, his fingers gently resting on Hank's coarse mane. "Let him talk, Maggie," he said calmly. "Men like Vernon don't know the damage they do until it circles back around." Vernon tilted his head, amused. "You really think that donkey's gonna fix what's broken? You lost your horses, your sight, your name in this town, and now you're hanging onto a stray." He laughed, but the sound fell flat in the quiet air. Maggie's chest tightened, but it was Hank who reacted first. The donkey stepped forward, placing himself directly between Vernon and Henry, ears twitching, body rigid. Vernon blinked, slightly thrown off. "Well, I'll be damned. He's got a little fight in him." Henry's voice came next, slow and steady. "He's not the only one." There was steel behind the softness in his tone, and even Vernon seemed to sense it. "I didn't come to fight," Vernon said, stepping back. "I just figured you might want to sell him back. No hard feelings. Full refund." He pulled a checkbook from his jacket. Maggie nearly exploded. "You're unbelievable," she hissed. But Henry only smiled faintly. "Not interested," he said. "I don't need a refund. I need a reason to wake up in the morning." Vernon stared at him for a long second, then snorted and turned away. After Vernon's truck disappeared down the road, Maggie sat beside Henry on the porch, her shoulders tense. "You should have let me say more," she muttered. "People can't just walk all over you." Henry shook his head. "I've spent a lot of years trying to win arguments, Maggie. Doesn't change what's already broken." He reached down and scratched Hank's neck. "This little guy, he doesn't ask anything from me. He just stays." The silence between them softened, and for the first time in years, Maggie felt like maybe, just maybe, her grandfather was still in there, buried under all that pain. As the sun began to dip, casting the ranch in gold, Hank brayed once, almost like a chuckle. Maggie couldn't help but smile. "You know," she said, "he might be the only one around here who knows what he's doing." A few days passed in quiet routine. Henry began spending his mornings walking the pasture with Hank, guided only by the soft thud of the donkey's hooves and the occasional brush of fur against his leg. The old man, once bitter and sealed off from the world, now spoke out loud to Hank, sometimes in stories, sometimes in silence. Maggie noticed the difference. Her grandfather wasn't healed, but something inside him had cracked open, and it wasn't leaking pain anymore. It was leaking light. One cloudy afternoon, Maggie found herself climbing into the attic, a place she hadn't dared to enter in years. The old pull-down ladder creaked under her weight as dust danced in the air. She wasn't even sure why she went up there. Maybe curiosity. Maybe guilt. What she didn't expect was to find a small wooden box, hidden beneath a folded tarp, with her mother's name, Lillian Malloy, etched in faded pen. Inside, she found a bundle of unopened letters, all addressed to Lillian, all written in Henry's handwriting. Maggie's hands trembled as she picked one up and unfolded it. The words were clumsy but raw, full of regret, apology, and love. "I didn't know how to say it when you were alive," one letter read, "but I never stopped being proud of you. I just didn't know how to be a father after your mother died." Maggie's breath caught. She had spent years believing Henry had abandoned her mother emotionally. Now she wasn't so sure. That night, she sat beside Henry on the porch, holding the box in her lap. She didn't say anything right away, just stared out at the stars, where Hank was quietly lying in the yard like a shaggy guardian. Then she placed the box gently on her grandfather's lap. "I found them," she said softly. Henry didn't move for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, small, hoarse, and stripped of defense. "I wrote them after the funeral," he whispered. "But I never sent them. Never thought I had the right." Maggie wiped a tear from her cheek. "You did," she said. "And maybe it would have helped. Maybe not. But they matter. They matter now." For a few moments, there was only wind. Then Hank rose and walked slowly toward the porch, resting his head on Henry's knee, almost like he knew. Henry placed a trembling hand on the donkey's forehead and closed his eyes. It was the first time Maggie had ever seen her grandfather cry. And from that moment on, she understood that Hank hadn't come to fix the past. He had come to walk with them into whatever came next. The next morning brought a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, uneasy. Henry felt it before Maggie even said a word. As she returned from her usual early walk around the property, her footsteps were quicker, heavier. "Grandpa," she called out from the porch, breath tight, "you need to come out to the west fence. Now." Henry rose slowly, leaning on his cane. Hank followed instinctively, his short legs padding quietly behind. When they reached the edge of the pasture, Henry stopped. "Tell me," he said, face turned toward the wind. Maggie hesitated. "Someone cut through the barbed wire," she said, voice hard. "2 posts pulled down, hoofprints all over the mud. I think someone tried to drive cattle across your land." Henry's jaw tightened. "Drummond's boys?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "Or worse. Maybe Vernon's son. You humiliated his dad. He's the type to retaliate." Henry took a long, slow breath. He hadn't had to defend his land in years, not since before he went blind. And now, someone thought he was too weak, too old, too distracted to notice a boundary being crossed. "This isn't just about land," he muttered. "It's about respect." Maggie knelt to examine the tracks again, snapping a photo with her phone. "Sheriff needs to see this," she said, "before it gets worse." Later that day, Sheriff Doyle Mercer came by in his dusty patrol truck. He walked the damaged fence line quietly, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Looks like someone tested your line overnight," he said. "And not by accident." He glanced at Hank, who stood between Henry and the fence like a furry little guard. "You think they'll come back?" Henry asked. Doyle didn't answer immediately. "If they think you're vulnerable, maybe." That evening, Henry sat on the porch sharpening an old pocketknife he hadn't touched in years. Maggie watched from the doorway, worried. "You're not planning to confront anyone, are you?" she asked. "You're not who you used to be." Henry paused. "Maybe not," he said. "But this land, this life, still means something. And sometimes, the only way to hold on to it is to stand your ground, even when you can't see what's coming." Just before dusk, Hank started pacing near the gate, ears twitching, nose to the wind. Something had changed in the air again, something coming closer. Maggie stepped out, heart pounding, staring toward the far hill. There were headlights in the distance. A truck creeping slow, silent, too far from the road to be innocent. Whatever was coming that night, it wouldn't be a visit. The truck's headlights hovered on the ridge for what felt like an eternity. Neither Henry nor Maggie moved. Hank, however, paced slowly near the porch steps, his ears alert and tail flicking in short, tense bursts. Maggie clenched her phone in her hand, thumb hovering over the call button. "I'm calling the sheriff," she said. Henry didn't answer. He was still, listening, like a man trained to hear things others couldn't. "Not yet," he said quietly. A few minutes later, the lights cut out. They vanished, just like that. Maggie took a step forward. "They're not leaving," she said under her breath. "They're hiding." Her voice trembled. Henry nodded. "They're walking now. Probably on foot." He reached down, hand resting on Hank's back. The donkey stood firm, unusually still, like a statue carved out of dirt and muscle. "Get the lantern," Henry said. "And that old Winchester from the shed." Maggie hesitated. "You haven't fired a gun since I could see," Henry finished. "Doesn't mean I forgot how." As Maggie disappeared into the house, Henry stood on the porch, breathing in the heavy air. He could feel them, whoever they were, watching from the darkness beyond the tree-line. Trespassers? Vandals? Or someone looking to send a message? It didn't matter. This was still his land. His life. He wasn't giving it up just because people thought he was too broken to defend it. Then there was a sound. A footstep. Soft, deliberate. Then another. Hank brayed, not loud, not panicked, but short and sharp. A warning. Maggie came rushing back with the lantern and rifle. She handed the gun to Henry, but his grip wasn't what it used to be. Still, he held it with a sense of memory, like he had trained for this moment without knowing it. He sat in his chair, resting the barrel across his knees. "Stay behind me," he told Maggie. "Keep the light low. Let them come close if they're coming." For several minutes, nothing happened. Just the creaking of old wood and Hank's slow breathing. Then, movement. 3 figures, creeping from the shadows. Hooded, faces hidden. One carried wire cutters. Another had a crowbar. They didn't see the donkey step forward until it was too late. Hank let out a sudden loud bray that echoed across the ranch like a siren. The figures froze. That's when Henry stood. Though he couldn't see them, they could see him. A blind man, standing tall with a rifle in one hand and a stubborn donkey beside him. "This is your only warning," he said, voice calm but cutting. And for the first time in years, the land went quiet out of respect. The figures stood frozen in the moonlight. For a moment, it was impossible to tell who was more surprised, the intruders or Henry Malloy. He couldn't see them, but he didn't need to. He could feel the tension in the air, like a wire pulled too tight. And beside him, Hank let out another sharp bray, louder this time, more urgent. It was as if the animal had taken it upon himself to become the line between danger and home. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering his hood. Maggie gasped. "Trent Pike," she said, disbelief cracking through her voice. The youngest son of Vernon, barely 22, stood awkwardly with the wire cutters still in hand. His 2 friends looked uneasy, their nerves visibly shaken. "We weren't gonna hurt nobody," Trent said, eyes darting. "Just meant to scare the old man a little. Teach him not to mess with our family." Henry didn't move. "You came onto my land. You tore my fence. You snuck around in the dark like cowards. You think this is a game?" His voice cut deeper than the barrel of the rifle. Maggie stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "My mother is buried on this land. My grandfather gave up his sight defending this ranch. And you think you're owed something because your daddy got embarrassed at a laylaw." Trent's face flushed red. "He's not right in the head," he mumbled, nodding toward Henry. "Buying a damn donkey, thinking it's a stallion. Everyone in town's laughing." But Henry stood tall, unbothered. "You think I didn't know what I was buying?" he asked, steady and low. Hank was the first soul in years who looked at me without pity. "Who stayed? That's worth more than any purebred." The boys shuffled nervously. Hank stepped forward again, blocking their path. He didn't make a sound, just stood his ground like he understood the stakes. Trent's friends turned and started backing away. "We should go," one whispered. But Trent lingered, as if expecting someone to stop him. Henry lifted the rifle. Not to shoot, but just enough to remind him that lines had been crossed. "You've got 5 seconds, Henry said. "After that, I stop being polite." Trent hesitated. Then he threw the cutters to the ground, muttered something under his breath, and ran after the others. Silence fell again. Maggie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Henry lowered the rifle. Hank nuzzled his side. For the first time, she didn't see a frail, blind man on a porch. She saw a protector, a man who still had fight left in him, and a donkey who knew exactly when to stand tall. The sun rose slowly over Malloy Ranch, casting long golden lines across the dewy grass. Everything was still, almost too still. The events of the night before hung in the air like leftover smoke from a long-burned fire. Henry sat quietly on the porch, hands folded over his cane, listening. Every chirp, Every rustle in the wind sounded louder now. Not because the world had changed, but because something inside him had. Maggie brought him coffee without saying a word. She didn't need to. There was a new kind of silence between them, one no longer built on old pain or things unsaid, but on understanding. She sat beside him and looked out at Hank, who was resting peacefully under the oak tree near the barn, ears flicking gently. "You think it's over?" she finally asked. Henry nodded slowly. "With them? Probably. But something else is just beginning." A few hours later, Sheriff Doyle pulled into the drive. He stepped out, hat in hand, face tight with concern. "I spoke to Vernon," he said. "He didn't know what his boy was up to. He's angry, embarrassed, and he wants to make it right." Henry turned his head slightly, listening. "Tell him I'm not angry," he said. "But this land, this home, it's not up for negotiation. I've got too little time left to waste forgiving the same people twice." Doyle gave a slow nod. "Fair enough. By the way, that donkey of yours? Whole town's talking about him. Some say it's the strangest thing they've seen in years. Others say it's the bravest." Maggie smirked. "They can laugh all they want. He's earned his place here." Hank, almost on cue, let out a soft bray from the distance. Henry chuckled. "That's right, boy. Let 'em talk." That afternoon, Maggie found Henry in the barn, brushing Hank's coat with slow, careful hands. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked quietly. "Selling the land, moving somewhere closer to help, to live?" Henry didn't stop brushing. "I used to think this place was all I had left of my life," he said. "But now I see, it's not the land I needed. It was purpose. And Hank gave that back to me." Maggie walked over and placed her hand on her grandfather's shoulder. "Then maybe it's time we both come back," she whispered. "Not just for you. For Mom. For everything this ranch still means." Henry didn't answer with words. He just reached up, covered her hand with his, and nodded. Out in the field, the wind picked up, and Hank raised his head like he felt something shifting, something healing. Autumn painted Malloy Ranch in gold and rust. The trees whispered with dry leaves, and the wind carried the scent of earth and memory. Henry sat on the porch, wrapped in his old flannel jacket, a mug of coffee warming his hands. His vision was long gone, but he could still feel the changing season in his bones. And every morning now began the same way, with Hank's soft steps beside him and Maggie's voice somewhere close, humming, moving, living. The ranch had grown quiet in a different way, less lonely, more peaceful. Maggie had officially moved back in. Her teaching job now only part-time, she spent her days tending the land and helping Henry with what he could no longer do alone. They were rebuilding, not just fences and barns, but trust, connection, and everything time had once tried to steal. And through it all, Hank was there, watching, waiting, listening. One chilly morning, Henry asked Maggie to take him for a walk past the old creek. She loaded Hank into the trailer and helped her grandfather climb in beside him. They drove slowly down the winding dirt road, Henry's hand resting gently on the donkey's back the entire way. "You remember this path?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Every stone, every bend. I used to race your mom down it on horseback when she was just a little thing." They stopped where the trees opened up, and Maggie helped Henry down. He leaned on her shoulder, the other hand holding Hank's lead. Together, they walked in silence. The birds chirped overhead, and the wind rustled the dry grass. Then Henry spoke. "I don't know how much longer I've got," he said plainly. "But I know I've already had more than I deserved." Maggie swallowed hard. "You've still got more to give." Henry stopped. He turned his face toward her. "Then promise me something," he said. "When I go, Don't bury me next to the others. Bury me right here, under this tree, where I can still hear the creek. And let Hank come visit me whenever he wants." Maggie couldn't speak. She only nodded, tears spilling quietly as she held his hand. That evening, back at the ranch, Henry sat once more in his rocker. Maggie made dinner. Hank laid at the edge of the porch, ears twitching. The sun dipped low behind the hills. Henry whispered, almost to himself, "Didn't think I had one more ride left in me." But he did. And in the end, it wasn't the horses that brought Henry Malloy home. It was a donkey, and the quiet redemption only love can offer.